The sun was relentless.
Looks
It
like
beat
our
down
special
on the
agent's
black
a little more
asphalt
special
of the
than he let
interstate,
on.
Conspiracy to
baking
commit
the
looks like
air into a
terrorism to me.
shimmering
Those are classified
haze that made
intelligence
the distant
materials.
cars look
You are
like
compromising a
watery,
national security
indistinct
operation, and you have no idea the crime you've just committed.
Inside
You're
his
untouchable. You're
nondescript
done. You hear
dark
me?
gray
Done.
sedan, Special Agent Marcus Thorne felt a single drop of sweat trace a path down his temple. The car's air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against the oppressive afternoon heat of the Southern California sun. To anyone who glanced over, he was just another man in a button-down shirt, tie loosened, enduring the daily commute. His face was a mask of placid neutrality, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. The persona was flawless, practiced, and utterly mundane. That was the point. For the past 6 weeks, Marcus had ceased to be a federal agent. He was Michael Bell, a mid-level logistics manager for a paper supply company, a life so profoundly boring it was the perfect camouflage. His real mission, Operation Sundown, was anything but. He was the linchpin in a multi-agency effort to dismantle a domestic terror cell that had acquired chemical precursors and was planning an attack on a major public transit hub. Today was a critical day. He had just completed a dead drop, passing encrypted intelligence to his handler and receiving new instructions embedded in a classifieds newspaper. The information he'd gathered over the last month, the trust he had painstakingly built with dangerous men, was all converging toward a single point in the next 48 hours. His mind was a careful balance of the mundane character he was playing and the razor-sharp focus of the agent underneath. He checked his rearview mirror out of habit, a tic ingrained through years of training at Quantico. His eyes scanned the traffic behind him, a pickup truck, a minivan, a red sports car. Everything was normal. He was just another anonymous vehicle on a river of steel and glass. He allowed himself a small internal sigh of relief. The tension of the dead drop was beginning to recede, replaced by the low-grade hum of anticipation for the mission's final phase. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and the promise he'd made to take her to that little Italian place on the coast once this was all over. A quiet dinner, the sound of the waves, no talk of work. That was the prize he kept his eyes on. He signaled his intention to move into the right lane, preparing for his exit. The maneuver was smooth, unhurried, with ample space between him and the car behind him. He glanced at his speedometer. 64 miles per hour, one below the speed limit. Every aspect of his driving was calculated to be unnoticeable, to blend into the background. He was a ghost. But ghosts can still cast shadows, and sometimes a shadow is all it takes to draw the wrong kind of attention. That's when he saw it. Far back in his mirror, a flash of red and blue. It was a police cruiser, weaving through the lighter traffic with a predatory grace. Marcus felt a faint prickle on the back of his neck, the instinctual alarm of an operative, but he quickly suppressed it. The cruiser wasn't for him. It was probably racing to an accident or pursuing a speeder. He had done nothing wrong. His registration was current, his insurance was paid, and the car he was driving was a clean rental, vetted by the Bureau. There was no reason for them to even look at him twice. The cruiser grew larger in his mirror. It settled in the lane directly behind him, the flashing lights now filling his entire car with pulsating strobes of color. The faint sound of the siren grew into a distinct, sharp wail, cutting through the low music playing on his radio. Marcus's heart rate remained steady, a testament to his immense self-control. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. This was a complication, an unwelcome variable, but it was manageable. He had a cover story, a legend memorized down to the last detail, and credentials that could, if necessary, be revealed. This would be a minor delay. A few minutes, a polite conversation, and he would be back on his way. His mission was still on track. He calmly activated his turn signal, a silent acknowledgement of the officer behind him. He began to slow the sedan, his eyes scanning the shoulder for a safe place to pull over. He chose a wide, clear stretch of asphalt just past an overpass, well away from the flow of traffic. He brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine humming quietly. He turned the key, silencing the car and the music. In the sudden quiet, The sound of the police siren winding down felt deafening. He placed both hands on top of the steering wheel, fingers spread, making them clearly visible through the windshield and the driver's side window. He had taught this procedure to civilians in community outreach programs. Signal. Pull over safely, turn off the car, hands on the wheel. Wait. He was following the book, every single rule. He was calm. He was professional. He was in control. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the man stepping out of the cruiser behind him had thrown the book away a long time ago. Officer Ryan Vance killed the siren but left the emergency lights bathing the gray sedan in a chaotic, silent disco of red and blue. The sun was hot on his face as he stepped out of his air-conditioned patrol car, the sudden wave of heat doing little to cool the thrum of impatience in his veins. At 32, Vance still had the lean, athletic build from his high school football days, but a hardness had settled in his eyes that wasn't there before. His 5 years on the force had chipped away at his initial idealism, replacing it with a cynical, rigid certainty. He saw the world in black and white, threats and non-threats, and his gut, he believed, was an infallible threat detector. His gaze was fixed on the sedan. It was a boring car, a family car, the kind of vehicle that usually held a soccer mom or a sales rep. But something about it had snagged his attention a few miles back. It wasn't speeding. It didn't have a broken taillight. It was, in fact, being driven with almost painful correctness. And that, to Vance, was suspicious in itself. He'd learned to be wary of those who tried too hard to be perfect. Perfection was a mask, and it was his job to rip masks off. The driver had made a lane change, perfectly legal, but Vance's mind had already framed it as an unsafe maneuver, a flimsy but sufficient pretext. The real reason for the stop was a feeling, a deep-seated instinct that something was off. It was the man behind the wheel, a black man in a shirt and tie driving a clean, late-model car. In Vance's internal calculus, honed by years of confirmation bias and street-level cynicism, the image didn't quite add up. It was an anomaly, and anomalies needed to be investigated. He approached the driver's side, his movements deliberate and heavy with authority. He kept his right hand ungloved, resting casually on the grip of his holstered firearm. This was his standard procedure for any stop he deemed non-routine, and in his mind, they were all non-routine. He didn't glance at the passenger side or the back seat on his approach. His focus was entirely on the driver, a single point of pressure. He saw the man's hands splayed on the steering wheel, a sign of compliance. Good. But it didn't relax him. Sometimes compliance was just another tactic. He stopped just behind the B-pillar, maintaining a position of tactical advantage. He didn't have to look at his own reflection in the car's window to know the image he projected. Crisp uniform, polished boots, mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes and turned the driver into a faceless figure. The image was one of absolute control. "License and registration," he said. His voice wasn't a question or a request. It was a flat, non-negotiable command. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't state his name or the reason for the stop. The niceties were for the public service announcements. This was the street, and on the street, you established dominance from the first word. The driver, Marcus, didn't move his hands from the wheel immediately. He first turned his head slowly. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The question was polite, the tone even and respectful. But to Vance, it was a challenge, a subtle pushback. His jaw tightened. "License and registration," he repeated, his voice a fraction of a degree colder. "Now." "Of course," Marcus replied, his voice still betraying no hint of anxiety. "I'm going to reach for the glove compartment first to get the registration and insurance. Then I will reach into my back pocket for my wallet. My movements will be slow and visible." Vance said nothing, his silence a form of pressure. He watched as the man, with painstaking deliberation, leaned over to the glove box, retrieved a small stack of papers, and placed them on the passenger seat. Then, just as he'd said, his right hand moved slowly toward his back pocket. The entire process was textbook, exactly what a compliant citizen was supposed to do. But instead of de-escalating the situation, the man's perfect composure felt like an affront to Vance. It felt practiced, almost condescendingly calm. It wasn't the nervous fumbling he was used to. It wasn't the reaction he expected. The man pulled out a simple black leather wallet. He opened it and retrieved his driver's license. But as he handed it up toward the window, another card was clearly visible in the plastic sleeve right next to it. It was dark, with a gold seal and bold federal lettering. Vance took the driver's license, his eyes barely glancing at the name, Michael Bell. His gaze was locked on the other card still in the wallet. "What's that?" he demanded, pointing a finger at the wallet. "That's my work identification, officer," Marcus said, his voice remaining level. "Let me see it," Vance commanded. Slowly, Marcus retrieved the second card and handed it over. It felt heavy, substantial. The gold seal of the Department of Justice gleamed in the harsh sunlight. The words were stark and undeniable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below that was a photograph of the man in the car and the name Special Agent Marcus Thorne. Vance stared at it, the blood pounding in his ears. A federal agent, a Fed. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Surprise, disbelief, and then a hot, surging resentment. For a normal police officer, this would have been the moment the entire situation deflated. An "oh" moment, followed by a professional apology, a quick handing back of the credentials, and a hasty retreat. It was a professional courtesy, an unspoken rule among law enforcement. You don't jam up one of your own, especially not a federal agent, over a phantom traffic violation. But Officer Ryan Vance was not a normal police officer. The sight of the FBI credentials didn't trigger respect or de-escalation, it lit a fuse. He held the two IDs in his hand, the driver's license for Michael Bell and the federal credentials for Special Agent Marcus Thorne. A fake name, an alias. To a reasonable mind, this would immediately signal an undercover operation. To Vance, it was proof of deception. This man had tried to lie to him, to pass himself off as some ordinary schmuck. The calm demeanor, the perfect compliance. It wasn't respect, it was a tactic. He felt a surge of indignation. This man, this agent, thought he was better than him. He thought his federal badge gave him a free pass. Vance looked from the ID back to Marcus's face. His own expression, hidden behind the mirrored sunglasses, hardened into a granite mask. The professional veneer he maintained, thin as it was, dissolved completely. This was no longer a traffic stop. It had become a contest of wills, a battle for authority on the side of a sun-bleached highway. "Special Agent Marcus Thorne," Vance said, his voice dripping with a newfound sarcasm. "That's a pretty important job. So which one are you? Michael Bell, the paper salesman? Or Marcus Thorne, the G-man?" Marcus's internal alarms, which had been buzzing quietly, were now screaming. He recognized this archetype of an officer instantly. Young, insecure, and dangerously territorial. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of his badge, and Marcus's federal credentials had just made it heavier. De-escalation was still the primary objective, but the path to it had just become infinitely more treacherous. "Officer, I am on official business," Marcus said, his voice low and firm, trying to convey the gravity of the situation without issuing a direct challenge. "The identification I provided is confidential. I would appreciate it if you would return it so I can be on my way. I can assure you, you are interfering with a federal investigation." The phrase, "interfering with a federal investigation," was a last resort, a clear and unambiguous warning. It was meant to be a final off-ramp before the situation spiraled. For Vance, it was gasoline on a fire. Who was this guy to lecture him about interference? This was his jurisdiction, his stop. "Official business?" Vance scoffed, taking a small step back from the car, creating more distance, a subtle act of aggression. "Is that what you call it? Driving with two different IDs? That sounds a lot like a crime to me. Step out of the car." The command was sharp, absolute. Marcus froze for a fraction of a second, processing the sheer irrationality of the order. He had provided credentials from the highest law enforcement agency in the country. He had warned the officer of his duty status. There was zero probable cause to order him out of the vehicle. This was a gross violation of protocol, and they both knew it. "Officer, with all due respect, you have no legal basis for that order," Marcus stated, his voice a tightrope walk between assertion and appeasement. "You have my identification. You can run my credentials. You will find they are valid. I am not stepping out of my vehicle." He was asserting his rights, but he was also giving Vance a way out, a chance to follow procedure and end this before it became irreparable. He could call it in, have his dispatcher confirm with the FBI's national database, and this whole thing would be over in 90 seconds. But Vance wasn't interested in procedure. He was interested in submission. Marcus's refusal, however calmly and legally stated, was the final insult. He saw it as defiance. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch 7 Adam 15, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I have a non-compliant male, refusing to exit the vehicle, requesting backup, code 3. Marcus watched in disbelief as Vance spoke into the radio. Code 3, lights and sirens. He was escalating a routine traffic stop with a positively identified federal agent into a high-priority backup call. This was no longer just a power trip. It was a deliberate, reckless act of antagonism. The window for a peaceful resolution was slamming shut. Through his side mirror, Marcus saw Vance step back further, his hand now resting firmly on the butt of his pistol, his stance widening into a classic shooter's pose. The sun glinted off the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses, making him look like a menacing, faceless enforcer. The quiet hum of the highway traffic seemed to fade away, replaced by the frantic pounding of Marcus's own heart, a rhythm he fought to control. He was an FBI agent, one of the most highly trained operatives in the world, and he was being held at a standstill by a patrol officer whose ego was writing checks his authority couldn't cash. And now, backup was on the way. The situation was about to get much, much worse. The sound of approaching sirens was a physical thing, a rising wave of noise that seemed to press in on Marcus's sedan from all directions. It was fast, too fast. Vance's call had clearly been prioritized. Within what felt like seconds but was probably closer to 2 minutes, 2 more patrol cars screeched to a halt behind Vance's cruiser, their tires kicking up dust and gravel from the shoulder. They parked in an angled tactical formation, creating a wall of steel and flashing lights that effectively caged Marcus in. The quiet, isolated stop had transformed into a full-blown scene. 2 more officers emerged from their vehicles. The first was a man with a thick build and a mustache that seemed permanently fixed in a frown. This was Officer Kevin Miller, a 10-year veteran who moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who rarely questioned orders. The second was a younger woman, Officer Jessica Riley, her expression sharp and alert, her eyes quickly taking in the scene. They didn't approach Marcus's car directly. Instead, they conferred with Vance, who stood like a general, pointing toward Marcus's window, his words sharp and clipped, audible only as an angry murmur. Marcus watched the exchange in his rearview mirror. He could see Vance holding up his license and FBI credentials, waving them for emphasis. He was controlling the narrative, framing Marcus as a potential threat before Miller and Riley had even formed their own opinions. He was poisoning the well. This was a classic tactic of a bully. Gather your allies, create an in-group, and isolate the target. The odds had just shifted from 1-on-1 to 3-on-1. The power dynamic on the roadside had changed irrevocably. With Vance alone, Marcus had a slim chance of reasoning with him, of appealing to protocol. With the arrival of 2 more officers who now saw the situation through Vance's distorted lens, his chances plummeted to near zero. The blue wall of silence, the instinct to back your partner no matter what, was now a tangible force field around him. After their brief huddle, the trio broke apart. Vance remained near Marcus's window, his posture even more rigid and self-assured than before. Officer Miller began a slow, deliberate walk toward the passenger side of the sedan, his hand also hovering near his weapon. Officer Riley took up a position further back, near the trunk, her eyes scanning the highway, creating a perimeter. They were treating him like a cornered felon, not a fellow law enforcement officer. Miller reached the passenger window and peered in, his hand cupped against the glass to block the sun's glare. His presence was an intrusion, a second point of pressure designed to disorient and intimidate. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. He breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. His training kicked in, a calming mantra in the sea of chaos. Observe, analyze, survive. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time." Vance's voice boomed, now amplified by the confidence of having his backup in place. "Step out of the vehicle, now!" Marcus knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue to assert his rights, refuse the unlawful order, and risk them smashing his window and dragging him out, escalating the physical confrontation. Or he could comply, exit the vehicle, and hope to de-escalate the situation verbally, face to face. Continuing to refuse would be seen as a confirmation of their manufactured suspicions. Compliance, however humiliating, was the only strategic option left to preserve his safety and, hopefully, the integrity of his mission. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for the door handle. "I am complying under duress," he stated, his voice loud and clear enough for any potential recording devices, including his own memory, to capture. "I want it on record that I am exiting the vehicle against my will and in response to an unlawful order." He pushed the door open slowly and began to step out, his movements measured and non-threatening. The blast of heat from the asphalt was immediate and intense. He stood up, raising his hands slowly to shoulder height, palms open, a universal sign of non-aggression. He was dressed in office casuals, a light blue button-down shirt, gray slacks, leather dress shoes. He looked exactly like what he was, a professional who had just left work. But Vance, Miller, and Riley didn't see a professional. They saw the non-compliant male Vance had described on the radio. They saw the man who had dared to question their authority. "Hands on the hood of your car," Miller grunted from the other side. "Turn around, face your vehicle," Vance commanded, his voice sharp as broken glass. Marcus turned slowly to face his car, the metal of the hood hot even through the fabric of his shirt as he placed his palms flat against it. He could feel the eyes of all three officers on his back. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel as Vance approached him from behind. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the crackle of a police radio. He was completely exposed, completely vulnerable, surrounded by a pack that had already decided he was guilty. The sun beat down on his neck, and for the first time that afternoon, Marcus Thorne felt a cold, chilling sense of dread. The pat-down was not professional. It was a violation. Vance's hands were rough, pressing hard as he searched Marcus's body, his movements jerky and unnecessarily forceful. He started at the ankles, slapping his way up Marcus's legs with a contemptuous disregard for personal space. Marcus remained perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his own faint reflection in the car's windshield. He focused on his breathing, on the grid of the car's defroster lines, on anything other than the utter humiliation of the moment. Each rough touch was a fresh insult, a physical assertion of Vance's dominance. "What's in your pockets?" Vance grunted, his hand pausing over Marcus's right front pocket. "A phone, a set of keys, and a money clip," Marcus replied, his voice a low monotone. "Nothing else." Vance dug his fingers in and pulled out the items, dropping them unceremoniously on the hot hood of the sedan. The metal keys made a sharp clatter. He found nothing, of course. No weapons, no contraband. Just the mundane accessories of an ordinary life, or an extraordinarily good cover. While Vance was conducting the pat-down, Officer Miller, with a silent nod from Vance, began to search the interior of Marcus's car. He opened the driver's door and started rummaging through the cabin without asking for permission, without a warrant, without any legal justification whatsoever. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle or my person," Marcus stated clearly, his voice projecting enough for Officer Riley, still standing guard, to hear. It was a legal formality, a statement for the record that he knew would be ignored. Miller paid him no mind. He rifled through the glove compartment, scattering the registration and insurance papers Marcus had so carefully retrieved earlier. He looked under the seats, his movements hurried and invasive. He picked up the folded classifieds newspaper from the passenger seat, the very newspaper containing Marcus's next set of mission-critical instructions. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. If Miller unfolded it, if he saw the tiny, almost invisible markings in the margins, the entire operation could be compromised. The lives of his fellow agents, the success of the mission, all hung in the balance, threatened by the clumsy hands of an officer on a power trip. But Miller was not looking for subtlety. He was looking for the obvious. Drugs, guns, large sums of cash. He tossed the newspaper back onto the seat in frustration and moved to the back. Finding nothing of interest there, he withdrew from the car. "It's clean," Miller announced to Vance, a hint of disappointment in his voice. The search of his car had yielded nothing, and the pat-down had proven he was unarmed. By any reasonable standard, the encounter should have ended right there. They had no traffic violation, no evidence of any crime, and a positive identification of a federal agent. But reason had left the scene the moment Vance's ego had been bruised. "Pop the trunk," Vance commanded, pressing a knee into the back of Marcus's thigh to keep him off balance. "The trunk latch is electronic." "It's on the keychain you just placed on the hood," Marcus said through gritted teeth. The indignity was mounting, layer by humiliating layer. Vance snatched the keys and pressed the button. The trunk lid swung open with a soft, hydraulic hiss, revealing the neatly organized contents within. A small overnight bag with a change of clothes, a car emergency kit, and a large, black, hard-shell Pelican case. Vance's eyes locked onto the case. It was the kind of case used to transport sensitive equipment, cameras, electronics, or firearms. To a suspicious mind, it was a treasure chest of possibilities. "What's in the case?" Vance demanded, walking toward the back of the car. Miller followed him, their interest piqued. "That is official United States government property," Marcus said, his voice rising with a new urgency. "It contains sensitive materials for my investigation. You are not authorized to open it." This was a red line. His cover, his mission, could withstand a traffic stop. It could not withstand a full-scale search of his undercover equipment. The case contained listening devices, a burner phone with encrypted contacts, and documents that would instantly blow his alias and put him and his targets in mortal danger. "I don't care who it belongs to," Vance shot back, his hand already on the latches of the case. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me taking a look." He fumbled with the latches. They were locked. "Where's the key?" he snarled, turning back to Marcus. "I will not give you the key," Marcus stated, his voice now as cold and hard as the steel of the handcuffs he knew were coming next. "Opening that case is a federal offense. I am warning you again, officer. Stand down." Vance's face, visible now as he turned away from the sun's glare, was a mask of pure fury. He had been challenged, warned, and defied. He had expected to find a common criminal, and instead he'd found a man who represented an authority greater than his own, a man who refused to break. And he couldn't stand it. He strode back to Marcus, his movements quick and aggressive. Miller mirrored him, taking up a position on Marcus's other side. They were closing in, the pretense of a lawful search completely abandoned. The air crackled with imminent violence. Under the bright, indifferent blue sky, surrounded by the mundane sounds of passing traffic, Marcus braced himself. The violation was no longer just about his rights. It was about to become brutally, physically real. The Pelican case sat in the trunk like a Pandora's box, its sturdy black exterior a silent challenge to Officer Vance's authority. His inability to open it only fueled his rage. He saw the locked case not as a boundary to be respected, but as a wall to be smashed through. The driver's calm, unwavering refusal to provide the key was, in Vance's mind, the ultimate admission of guilt. Only a man with something significant to hide would so adamantly protect a locked box from the police. "You're obstructing my investigation," Vance declared, his voice tight. It was a catch-all accusation, a flimsy legal hook upon which he could hang his escalating aggression. "You don't have an investigation," Marcus retorted, his patience finally worn thin. "You have a traffic stop based on a lie, and you are now attempting an illegal search of federal property. You are the one obstructing justice." The words hit Vance like a physical blow. He stalked back to where Marcus stood pressed against the car, his face inches from Marcus's. The mirrored sunglasses were gone, tucked into his shirt collar, and Marcus could see the raw, unrestrained anger in his eyes. They were wide, pupils dilated, a clear sign of an adrenaline surge. This was the most dangerous phase of any confrontation, the point where an officer's emotional response completely overrides their training and judgment. "You think you're untouchable because of that little tin badge?" Vance spat, his voice low and menacing. "Out here on my street, you're just another mouth." Without another word, he grabbed Marcus's arm and twisted it violently behind his back. The motion was sudden and jarring, sending a jolt of pain through Marcus's shoulder. At the same time, Officer Miller moved in, grabbing Marcus's other arm, his heavy frame adding leverage. Officer Riley, who had been watching from a distance with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, now moved closer, her hand resting on her taser, her expression hardening into one of resolute backup. The pack was united. Marcus didn't resist. His training screamed at him that fighting back against 3 armed officers was a death sentence. His best weapon was his mind, his ability to remain the calm center of the storm they were creating. He allowed them to force his arms behind him, the awkward angle sending waves of fire through his joints. Vance fumbled for his handcuffs, his movements clumsy in his anger. He cinched the first cuff around Marcus's right wrist, pulling it brutally tight, the serrated steel biting deep into the flesh. He did the same with the left, connecting them with a sharp metallic click. The sound was unnervingly final. Special Agent Marcus Thorne, a man who had faced down cartel enforcers and infiltrated extremist militias, was now handcuffed on the side of a highway for a crime that didn't exist. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the officers pressing him against the car. He could feel the eyes of passing drivers on him, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment. A few cars were slowing down, their occupants' cell phones raised. They were becoming a spectacle. "You are making a career-ending mistake, Vance," Marcus said, his voice strained from the awkward position. The use of his name seemed to enrage Vance further. "The only one making a mistake here is you," he shot back. "We're going to find out what's in that box, and we're going to find out who you really are." Leaving Marcus cuffed and pressed against the car under the watchful eye of Miller, Vance returned to the trunk. His frustration with the lock now had a new outlet. He went to his patrol car and returned with a Halligan bar, a heavy-duty prying tool used by firefighters for forced entry. "Officer, that is a direct order from a federal agent. Do not open that case," Marcus yelled, his voice echoing across the shoulder. His words were useless. Vance wedged the forked end of the heavy steel bar into the seam of the Pelican case and threw his full body weight against it. The high-impact polymer groaned in protest. He strained, his face red with exertion. With a loud crack, the first latch broke. He repositioned the bar and slammed his weight down again. A second crack echoed, and the lid of the case popped open. Vance, Miller, and Riley peered inside. But they didn't find what they were expecting. There were no bricks of cocaine, no stacks of unmarked bills, no illegal firearms. Instead, they saw a meticulously organized interior of foam cutouts holding a collection of strange and sophisticated electronic devices. There was a small, high-powered listening device, a set of lock-picking tools, a burner phone, and a GPS tracker no bigger than a quarter. There was also a slim file folder. Vance snatched the folder and opened it. Inside were surveillance photos of several men, the primary targets of Operation Sundown. Alongside them were detailed schematics of a city bus terminal, with certain areas circled in red. To the untrained eye, it looked like a meticulously planned heist, or worse. To Vance, It was the ultimate justification.
He had been right all along.
Well, 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 Vance said, a triumphant sneer spreading across his face as he held up the file. Looks like our special agent is a little more special than he let on. Conspiracy to commit... What do we have here? Looks like terrorism to me. He slammed the file down on the trunk lid. The tools of Marcus's hidden trade, the very items meant to keep the city safe, had just been twisted into the evidence that would be used to condemn him. The accusation hung in the hot, stagnant air, absurd and menacing. Terrorism. The word was a bomb, and Officer Vance had just detonated it with a smug, victorious grin. For Marcus, the situation had crossed a terrifying threshold. This was no longer about a bruised ego or a violation of rights. He was now being accused of the very crime he was trying to prevent. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in his throat. "Those are classified intelligence materials," Marcus stated, forcing the words through a tight jaw. The handcuffs were cutting off the circulation to his hands, which were beginning to throb with a numb, painful pulse. "You have no idea what you're doing. You are compromising a national security operation." "Save it," Vance snapped, waving the file dismissively. "You can tell your story to the detectives downtown." He turned to Officer Riley. "Read him his rights." Officer Riley, who had been silent up to this point, seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. Her eyes met Marcus's, and in them he saw a flicker of doubt, a momentary crack in her hardened professional exterior. She had seen the FBI credentials. She had heard his warnings. She knew on some level that this was spiraling out of control. But the pressure to conform, to back her partner's play, was immense. The moment passed. Her expression became impassive, and she began to recite the Miranda warning in a flat, detached voice. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar words Marcus himself had recited to suspects countless times, now sounded like a surreal death knell to his mission. Each phrase was another shovel of dirt on the grave of Operation Sundown. As Riley's voice droned on, a small crowd of bystanders began to gather on the pedestrian walkway of the overpass above them. Their phones were out, small black rectangles pointed down, recording the entire drama. Another person at a nearby gas station was also filming, their lens a distant, unblinking eye. The sight of the cameras seemed to galvanize Vance. He was no longer just an officer, he was a performer on a public stage. His voice got louder, his gestures more theatrical. He was playing the part of the heroic cop who had just taken down a dangerous criminal. "On your knees!" Vance barked at Marcus after Riley had finished the Miranda rights. Marcus didn't move. "I am not resisting, but I will not kneel," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was a small act of defiance, a refusal to be completely debased. The refusal was all the excuse Vance needed. He and Miller grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and forced him down, his knees hitting the gritty asphalt with a painful crunch. The rough surface tore through the fabric of his slacks. A sharp pain shot up his leg, but he refused to cry out. He would not give them the satisfaction. "See? Still resisting," Vance announced loudly for the benefit of the cameras above. "This is what we have to deal with." He yanked Marcus to his feet and began marching him toward his patrol car, shoving him forward unnecessarily. Marcus stumbled but caught his balance, his cuffed hands making the movement awkward. They reached the rear door of the cruiser, and Vance pushed his head down with a rough hand, forcing him to duck into the back seat. The interior of the car was an oven, the black vinyl seats searingly hot. The air was thick and smelled of stale coffee and industrial-strength cleaner. Vance slammed the door shut, plunging the back seat into a world of distorted reflections and muffled sounds. Through the reinforced window, Marcus could see the scene playing out like a silent movie. Vance, Miller, and Riley were now handling the evidence, their movements full of self-importance as they placed the Pelican case and the classified file into the trunk of a patrol car. A deep, cold rage began to build inside Marcus, a rage he had to suppress with every ounce of his discipline. It wasn't just for himself, it was for the mission. The men in those photos were scheduled to meet that evening to finalize their attack plan. His absence would be a massive red flag. They would scatter, or worse, accelerate their timeline. People would die, and it would all be because Officer Ryan Vance couldn't handle being challenged by a black man with a badge bigger than his. He looked down at his wrists. The steel of the handcuffs was biting into his skin, leaving deep red welts. The cold click of the locking mechanism still echoed in his mind. It was the sound of a system failing. It was the sound of injustice being swiftly and efficiently dispensed on the side of a sun-drenched American highway. He was trapped, and the clock was ticking, not just on his freedom, but on the lives of innocent people. Inside the sweltering patrol car, Marcus became a passive observer of his own undoing. His world had shrunk to the confines of the back seat, a cage of plexiglass and steel. But outside, another narrative was being meticulously recorded, one that would ultimately become his greatest weapon. Unknown to him at that moment, Officer Riley's body-worn camera had been activated the moment she stepped out of her vehicle. Its small, unblinking lens was capturing every word, every gesture, every escalating moment of the encounter with objective digital clarity. The footage would later be played for juries, for internal affairs investigators, and for a furious public. It began with the huddle, showing Vance's animated and aggressive briefing to his fellow officers, his words painting Marcus as deceptive and non-compliant from the start. "Says he's a Fed, but he's got a fake ID," Vance's voice, tinny and distorted, could be heard saying. "Refusing all lawful orders. Something's not right with this guy." He was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, priming his backup to see a threat where none existed. The camera, pinned to Riley's chest, captured the entire search. It recorded Marcus's clear and unwavering statement, "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." It then recorded Miller ignoring that statement and proceeding with the search anyway. It caught the exchange about the Pelican case, Marcus's voice steady and professional as he identified it as government property and warned them not to open it. The most damning portion, however, was the audio. The digital microphone was unforgiving. It picked up the stark contrast between Marcus's controlled, respectful tone and Vance's escalating hostility. "Step out of the car," Vance's voice commanded. "Officer, with all due respect, you have no legal basis for that order," Marcus's voice replied, calm and reasoned. The camera recorded Vance's baiting questions. "Which one are you? Michael Bell, the paper salesman? Or Marcus Thorne, the G-man?" And Marcus's professional response, "Officer, I am on official business. You are interfering with a federal investigation." The footage was a perfect timeline of the confrontation, showing a man doing everything in his power to de-escalate, and an officer doing everything in his to provoke. It captured the breaking of the Pelican case, the triumphant crowing as Vance discovered the evidence, and the hollow procedural recitation of the Miranda rights. But the body camera was not the only lens on the scene. From the overpass above, a citizen journalist with a high-definition smartphone was recording a wider, more damning view. This footage showed the physical aspect of the arrest in brutal detail. It showed 3 officers surrounding one man. It showed Vance and Miller using excessive force to push Marcus against his car and then down to his knees. It showed the raw aggression that the body camera, with its limited perspective, couldn't fully convey. The bystander's video also captured something else. The context. It showed Marcus standing calmly outside his car before being forced to the hood. It showed his slow, deliberate movements. And it showed the faces of the officers, particularly Vance, whose expression was a clear mask of rage. Inside the patrol car, Marcus was unaware of the extent of this documentation. His focus was singular: how to salvage his mission. He needed to contact his supervisor, Agent in Charge Reynolds. Reynolds could make one phone call and end this entire nightmare. He could vaporize this situation with a single word to the police chief. He saw Officer Vance approaching the driver's side of the patrol car and tapped on the plexiglass divider. Vance slid into the driver's seat, the car rocking with his movement. He started the engine, and a blast of cool air finally began to circulate through the stifling vehicle. "Officer Vance," Marcus said, his voice even. "I need to make a phone call. It is my right. I need to contact my supervisor." Vance glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with contempt. "You've got no rights right now except the ones Officer Riley just read to you. You can make a call from the station." "This isn't a request, it's a procedural necessity," Marcus pushed, knowing it was a long shot. "You have detained a federal agent. Standard protocol in every department in this country is to immediately verify my status with my field office. You are deliberately breaking protocol." Vance just laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Protocol went out the window when you started playing games with your identity and talking about terrorism plots. You're not a federal agent to me anymore. You're a suspect." He put the car in drive, but before he could pull away, a sharp rap on the passenger side window stopped him. It was Sergeant Frank Davis, a senior officer whose patrol car had just quietly rolled up to the scene. His arrival was unannounced by sirens. He was older, with tired eyes and a salt-and-pepper mustache that had seen thousands of these roadside dramas. And from the weary, exasperated look on his face, this was one he already regretted attending. The unblinking eye of the camera was about to be joined by the tired, knowing eyes of a supervisor. Sergeant Frank Davis was a man who operated on a low boil. After 25 years on the force, very little surprised him, but he had a keen nose for incidents that were about to generate mountains of paperwork. The moment he'd heard Vance's Code 3 call for a non-compliant mail and cross-referenced it with the location, a familiar sense of dread had settled in his stomach. Ryan Vance had a file thick with citizen complaints, all of them dismissed, but the pattern was undeniable. Aggressive, escalated stops involving minority drivers. Davis had been hoping Vance was on the other side of the city, no such luck. He hadn't sped to the scene. He had driven, knowing that arriving like a freight train would only validate Vance's over-the-top response. As he stepped out of his car, the scene that greeted him was exactly what he had feared. 3 cruisers, a cuffed suspect in the back of a car, and Vance standing with his chest puffed out like he'd just single-handedly stopped an alien invasion. Worse, Davis could see the bystanders on the overpass, their phones like tiny vultures circling a kill. "Vance, what in the hell is all this?" Davis asked, his voice a low grumble that cut through Vance's self-congratulatory posture. He didn't wait for an answer, instead rapping his knuckles on the passenger window of Vance's cruiser. Vance rolled the window down, his bravado deflating slightly in the presence of his direct supervisor. "Sarge, we got a good one here. This guy," he jerked a thumb toward the back seat, "is playing some kind of game. Pulled him over for a bad lane change. He's got 2 different IDs. One of them says he's FBI." "He says he's FBI?" Davis asked, his tired eyes narrowing. "Did you run the credentials?" "No need," Vance said quickly. "He's got a case in the trunk full of break-in tools and schematics for the bus terminal. We're talking a potential terror threat. I made the call to detain him." Davis stared at Vance for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, Vance finding the evidence that perfectly justified his initial baseless stop. It was too neat. "You broke open his case?" "It was locked. He was being obstructive," Vance said defensively. Davis let out a slow breath and rubbed a hand over his face. "Stay here," he ordered, then walked to the back door and opened it. The blast of cool air from the front of the car was a brief relief for Marcus. He looked up at the sergeant, a man whose face was a roadmap of long shifts and departmental politics. Here, finally, was a potential voice of reason. "I'm Sergeant Davis," the man said, his voice devoid of the aggression Marcus had been dealing with. "What's your story?" "Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI," Marcus said, his voice clear and steady despite the throbbing in his wrists. "My credentials and my undercover driver's license are with Officer Vance. I'm on a time-sensitive federal operation. I have repeatedly told your officers this, and I have repeatedly requested to speak with my supervisor to verify my status. They have denied every request." Davis listened intently, his eyes flicking from Marcus's face down to the tightly cinched handcuffs. He could see the deep purple welts already forming. "He's lying, Sarge," Vance yelled from the front seat. "He's a con man!" Davis ignored him. "What's this about plans for the bus terminal?" he asked Marcus. "That is classified intelligence related to my operation. It is evidence in an ongoing national security case. Your officer illegally broke open a federally sealed case to access it, compromising my investigation and potentially endangering lives." Every word Marcus spoke was precise, professional, and devoid of the hysterical anger Vance was displaying. To Sergeant Davis, who had spent a career reading people, the contrast was stark and deeply troubling. One man sounded like a lawman. The other sounded like a hothead who'd gotten in over his skis. "Officer Vance," Davis said, turning his head slightly, "give me the IDs." Vance reluctantly got out of the car and handed the 2 cards to Davis. Davis examined the FBI credentials under the bright sun. They looked and felt authentic. The seal was correct, the lamination perfect. A fake would have likely been spotted by a veteran like him instantly. He looked back at Marcus. "If I call this in, it's going to check out?" 100%, Marcus confirmed. "My agent in charge is expecting a check-in. My failure to do so has likely already triggered an alert." This was the critical juncture. The protocol was simple. When in doubt, verify. A quick call from Davis to his dispatcher, who would then contact the local FBI field office, would clear this up in minutes. It was the safe play, the right play, the only play that wouldn't result in a massive lawsuit and a public relations disaster. Marcus watched, holding his breath, as Davis reached for his radio. This was it, the end of the madness. But then Vance stepped up next to Davis, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Sarge, don't. Think about it. If you call it in and he is a Fed, he's going to file a complaint that'll bury us. He'll say I profiled him, that we conducted an illegal search. But if we take him in based on the evidence we found, the schematics, the tools, it justifies the stop. It protects us. It's his word against 3 cops." It was a poisonously logical argument, an appeal to the worst instincts of the us versus them mentality. It was a plea to protect their own, right or wrong. Davis froze, his hand hovering over his radio. He looked from Vance's pleading, desperate face to Marcus's calm, steady gaze in the back seat. He was caught between procedure and politics, between doing what was right and doing what was easy for his men. The sergeant's shoulders slumped. He lowered his hand from the radio. "Put the evidence in my trunk," he said to Vance, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll sort this out at the station." He shut the door on Marcus, the sound a dull thud. He had made his choice. He had chosen his men over the truth. Protocol was denied. The last off-ramp had been missed, and Marcus was now being driven deeper into a nightmare, all to protect an officer who was clearly disastrously in the wrong. Sergeant Frank Davis's decision to sort this out at the station was not a solution. It was a postponement of the inevitable explosion. He was kicking the can down the road, hoping that by moving the problem off the public highway and into the controlled environment of the precinct, he could somehow mitigate the damage. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that Vance had screwed up. He also knew that admitting it on the scene, in front of bystanders and with Riley and Miller watching, would be seen as undermining his own officer. It was a weak justification, and he was ashamed of it, but it was the one he made. He personally oversaw the transfer of the Pelican case and the intelligence file into the trunk of his own vehicle. He wanted control of the evidence that Vance was so proud of. As he handled the file, he glanced at the photos and schematics. It didn't look like the work of a common criminal. It was too precise, too detailed. It looked exactly like what a federal agent would be carrying. "You drive him," Davis ordered Vance, pointing to Marcus's sedan. "I'll transport the suspect. Riley, Miller, you follow me. Radio silence. We don't talk about this until we're in my office." The command was a clear sign that Davis was taking over, but it was too little too late. The damage was done. As Marcus was transferred from Vance's car to Davis's, he made one last appeal. "Sergeant," he said, meeting the older man's gaze, "you know this is wrong. You can still fix this right now with one phone call." Davis couldn't meet his eyes. He just grunted and guided Marcus into the back seat of his own cruiser, the vinyl of these seats just as hot and unwelcoming. The drive to the station was silent and suffocating. Marcus watched the city scenery pass by, every block taking him further away from his mission and deeper into a bureaucratic quagmire. The clock was ticking relentlessly. He tried to estimate the time. It had to have been close to an hour since the initial stop. His window to act was closing fast. They arrived at the precinct through a rear sally port, avoiding the public entrance. The entire procedure felt clandestine, as if Davis himself knew he was smuggling a problem into his own house. They led Marcus not to a standard interrogation room, but directly to Sergeant Davis's small, cluttered office. It was a sign, however small, that this was not being treated as a normal arrest. Davis shut the door, leaving Miller and Riley standing awkwardly in the hallway. He gestured for Vance to stand in the corner, then sat down heavily behind his desk. He finally removed Marcus's handcuffs, tossing them onto a pile of paperwork. The relief was immediate and agonizing as blood rushed back into Marcus's numb hands. He instinctively rubbed his wrists, the deep, raw grooves a stark reminder of the last hour. "Okay, Thorne or Bell or whoever you are," Davis said, leaning forward. "No cameras, no bystanders, just you and me. Tell me what the hell is going on, and it better be good."
This was the moment.
The first real opportunity to explain the situation to someone who might actually listen. Marcus took a deep breath, marshaling his thoughts. "My name is Special Agent Marcus Thorne," he began, his voice even and professional. "My badge number is 734F12. I am assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force out of the Los Angeles field office. For the past 6 weeks, I have been working a deep cover operation under the alias Michael Bell. The operation is codenamed Sundown." He laid out the bare bones of the mission: a domestic extremist cell, a planned attack on public infrastructure, the time-sensitive nature of the intelligence. He explained that the materials in the Pelican case were surveillance equipment, and the file contained critical intelligence that he was supposed to be acting on right now. "The men in those photos are meeting tonight to finalize their plan," Marcus said, leaning forward, his voice laced with an urgency he could no longer conceal. "My absence from that meeting will not go unnoticed. At best, they scatter and we lose them for months. At worst, they panic and accelerate their timeline. You need to let me contact my agent in charge, AIC Reynolds. He will confirm every word I'm saying." Davis listened, his expression grim. Everything Marcus said had the unmistakable ring of truth. The details were too specific, the potential consequences too dire for it to be a fabrication. He looked over at Vance, who was shifting his weight in the corner, his face a mixture of defiance and dawning fear. Vance had wanted to be a hero, to uncover a major plot. It was now becoming terrifyingly clear that he had instead stumbled into the middle of one and was in the process of blowing it up. The phone on Davis's desk buzzed. He picked it up, listened for a moment, and his face went pale. "Yeah, okay, send him in." He hung up the phone and looked at Marcus, then at Vance. A new, more potent authority had just arrived at the station, one that superseded his own. "Well, Vance," Sergeant Davis said, his voice heavy with a grim sense of finality, "it seems Agent Thorne's failure to check in did, in fact, trigger an alert. The front desk just informed me that 2 gentlemen from the FBI are in the lobby, and they are asking for their agent." The reluctant authority of Sergeant Davis was about to be replaced by the full, unyielding weight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The game was over. The arrival of the FBI agents felt less like a knock on the door and more like a controlled demolition. The 2 men who entered Sergeant Davis's office were the physical embodiment of federal authority. They were both in their 40s, dressed in sharp, conservative suits that seemed immune to the California heat. Their expressions were granite, their eyes sweeping the room and taking in every detail: the rumpled sergeant, the nervous young officer in the corner, and finally, Marcus, rubbing his bruised wrists. The lead agent, a tall man with graying temples, flashed his credentials. "AIC Reynolds, FBI. This is Agent Peters. We believe you are holding one of our agents." His voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of cold, immense power. He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact. Sergeant Davis, for the first time, looked truly overwhelmed. He stood up slowly. AIC Reynolds, Sergeant Frank Davis, it's a complicated situation. Reynolds' gaze fell on Marcus. Agent Thorne, are you all right? I'm fine, sir, Marcus replied, the single word sir instantly re-establishing the official chain of command and completely cutting the local officers out of the loop. Reynolds' eyes then shifted to the raw, red marks on Marcus's wrists. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It doesn't look fine, he said, his voice dropping a full octave. He turned his attention to Davis. Sergeant, my agent was on a critical, time-sensitive undercover assignment. He missed 2 mandatory check-ins. His last known location via his vehicle's tracker was on the side of Interstate 5, where he was stationary for 57 minutes. I want to know right now why he was taken into custody. The entire pretense that Vance had constructed began to crumble under the weight of Reynolds' direct, surgical questioning. The flimsy justification for the traffic stop was the first stone to fall. My officer initiated a traffic stop for an unsafe lane change, Davis began, already sounding defensive. Unsafe lane change? Agent Peters, who had been silent until now, spoke up. He held up a tablet. We have the dashcam footage from Agent Thorne's vehicle. It's automatically uploaded to our servers. The lane change was executed perfectly, with over 6 car lengths of space. There was no violation. So, let's try again. What was the real reason for the stop? Vance, from his corner, finally spoke, his voice cracking with a desperate attempt at justification. He was acting suspicious. He had 2 different IDs, a fake name. Reynolds turned his head slowly to look at Vance, a predator noticing an annoying insect. He is an undercover agent, you imbecile. He's supposed to have an alias. It's called a cover. His federal credentials, which I assume he provided, should have ended your suspicion immediately. Did he or did he not identify himself as an FBI agent? He did, but... Vance started. But what? Reynolds cut him off, stepping toward him. But you didn't believe him? Did you think the United States Department of Justice hands these out as party favors? Did you follow standard interagency protocol and attempt to verify his status? We were investigating. You were not investigating, Reynolds thundered, his voice now filling the small office, making the air vibrate. You were on a fishing expedition. You profiled a man, and when he turned out to be a federal agent, your ego couldn't handle it. You decided to escalate instead of de-escalate. You put my agent, your own officers, and a multi-million-dollar federal investigation at risk. He turned back to Davis. And you, Sergeant, you let this happen. You were on scene. You could have shut this down, but you chose to back your officer's transparently false narrative. You brought him here instead of making a simple phone call. Davis sagged back into his chair, the fight completely gone from him. He knew Reynolds was right. The justification for the stop was a lie. The justification for the search was non-existent. The justification for the arrest was a fabrication. The entire edifice of their actions had been built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was now coming in. Reynolds looked back at Marcus. The materials from the case? Confiscated by Sergeant Davis. They're likely in his vehicle, Marcus said. Get them, Reynolds ordered Peters, who immediately left the office. He then turned his steely gaze back on Vance. Officer Vance, your initial justification, the traffic stop, has just been proven false by video evidence. Everything that followed, every order you gave, every action you took was therefore illegal, the fruit of a poisonous tree. You conducted an illegal search, followed by an illegal seizure of federal property, and culminated in the illegal detention of a federal officer in the performance of his duties. That is a federal crime. The word crime hung in the air. Vance's face went white. He had started his day looking for a criminal, and in the space of a few hours he had become one himself. The flimsy wall of justification he had built around his actions had not just crumbled, it had been utterly obliterated. leaving him exposed and facing consequences he had never imagined were possible. The silence in Sergeant Davis's office was thick and heavy, broken only by the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Officer Vance stood frozen in the corner, the color drained from his face, the gravity of his actions finally crashing down on him. Sergeant Davis stared at the surface of his desk, at the mountains of old files and coffee-stained papers, seemingly unable to look at anyone in the room. The authority he once held had been stripped away, leaving behind only the weary shell of a man facing the worst administrative nightmare of his career. Agent Peters returned, carrying the Black Pelican case and the intelligence file. He placed them on the desk in front of AIC Reynolds with a quiet reverence, as if handling sacred artifacts. Reynolds opened the case, his expert eyes quickly scanning the contents to ensure everything was intact and untampered with. He flipped through the file, his expression growing more grim with each page he turned. He looked up at Marcus. "The meet is in 90 minutes, Reynolds said, his voice low and urgent. "Can you still make it?" The question cut through the fog of the past few hours, instantly refocusing Marcus on what truly mattered. The humiliation, the anger, the bruised wrists, all of it faded into the background. The mission was still alive. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, his voice firm. "My cover is as a low-level courier. Being late and rattled is explainable. Being a no-show is not. I can still do this." "Good," Reynolds nodded. He looked at Davis. "My agent is leaving, now. He is not being charged with anything because he has committed no crime. We are taking our property. This conversation, however, is not over. You can expect to hear from the U.S. Attorney's Office by morning." There was no negotiation, no discussion. It was a declaration. Davis simply nodded, a gesture of complete surrender. Marcus and the two agents turned to leave. There was no apology from Davis or Vance. There was no acknowledgement of their catastrophic mistake, no expression of regret. There was only a thick, suffocating silence filled with shame and the unspoken threat of legal retribution. Marcus walked out of the office and down the hallway of the police precinct, his head held high. He didn't look back. As they stepped out of the precinct's rear entrance and into the still bright afternoon sun, the sense of urgency returned with a vengeance. The world outside had kept moving while he had been trapped in their bureaucratic cage. "Your sedan is in their impound lot," Peters said, handing Marcus a set of keys. "This is a clean vehicle from the field office motor pool. Your primary communication gear is inside. Your backup weapon is in a locked compartment under the driver's seat." "The file?" Marcus asked, his mind already racing, cycling through contingency plans. "It appears untouched," Reynolds said grimly. "But we have to assume it's compromised. We have to assume they photographed or copied every page. We're scrubbing the physical meat. We'll have to pivot to the secondary plan." The secondary plan was riskier. It involved a remote detonation trigger for the chemical agents they had acquired, a fail-safe the extremists had devised in case their primary plan was disrupted. Marcus was the only one who knew the abort codes that could neutralize the trigger. His presence was more critical than ever, but the parameters of the mission had changed entirely. His wrongful arrest had sent a shockwave through the entire operation. As he slid into the driver's seat of the new vehicle, the adrenaline that had sustained him for the past few hours began to wane, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked tired. His shirt was rumpled, his face was strained, and there was a small tear in the knee of his slacks from where Vance had forced him to the ground. He looked like a man who had been through an ordeal. It was a look that, ironically, might just save his cover. He started the engine. The quiet power of the vehicle was a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He had been released, but he wasn't free. The consequences of the last 2 hours were rippling outward, jeopardizing not just his career, but the safety of hundreds of innocent civilians. He pulled out of the police station parking lot, the weight of his mission now heavier than ever. He had been vindicated, but the victory felt hollow. The clock was ticking, and he was running out of time to prevent a disaster that, in a terrible way, had been set in motion by the very people sworn to protect the city. The moment Marcus pulled away from the police station, his training took over, compartmentalizing the rage and humiliation of his arrest. There would be time for that later. Now, there was only the mission. He sped through the city streets, the vehicle a silent, anonymous dart navigating the urban labyrinth. Through his earpiece, a secure channel crackled to life. It was Reynolds, coordinating the new plan from a mobile command post. "Marcus, talk to me," Reynolds' voice came through, calm and steady. "Are you compromised?" "Negative, sir," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning every intersection, every rear-view mirror. "My cover story allows for minor run-ins with the law. I can play this as a shakedown by dirty cops. It will explain my delay and my disheveled state. It might even enhance my credibility." "Good.
That's what we were hoping,"
Reynolds said. "The target, a man named Elias Vance, no relation, ironically, has moved up the timeline. Our signals intelligence indicates he's become paranoid. He believes there's a leak. He's initiated the secondary protocol. He's moving the device to a new location, a crowded outdoor market downtown. He intends to detonate it in less than an hour." A cold dread washed over Marcus. The market was packed at this time of day, filled with families and tourists. The casualty count would be catastrophic. "Do we have a location on him?" "We do," Reynolds confirmed. "He's using a burner phone. We have a lock on the signal. He's in a white panel van heading south on Grand Avenue, but he's not alone. He has a spotter. We can't move on him without tipping them off. If he thinks he's cornered, he'll hit the button. You are the only one who can get close enough to neutralize the threat without causing a panic." The plan was simple and suicidally dangerous. Marcus had to intercept the van, use his undercover persona to get close to Elias, and input the abort codes into the detonation device before Elias realized what was happening. The entire JTTF was now converging on the location, creating a silent, invisible perimeter. But Marcus was the tip of the spear. He was the only one who could walk into the heart of the fire. He found the white van stuck in traffic just a few blocks from the market. It was exactly as described. Marcus pulled up alongside it, rolling down his window. He made eye contact with the driver, Elias, a man with haunted eyes and a fanatic's conviction. "Hey, Mike!" Elias called out, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I got held up," Marcus said, injecting a believable amount of frustration and anger into his voice. He gestured to his torn pants. "Got hassled by some cops. A real shakedown. I told you this city was crawling with them." The story worked perfectly. Elias's paranoia was directed at the authorities, and Marcus's story confirmed his fears. "I knew it," Elias snarled. "We have to move. Now, follow me. We're changing the drop point." This was the opening Marcus needed. He followed the van as it turned down a narrow alley behind the market. It was the perfect location for an ambush, but also a perfect kill box. The van stopped, and Elias got out, clutching a small, heavy backpack. "The plan's changed," Elias said, his eyes darting around nervously. "The package is live. We're doing it here, now." "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Marcus said, holding up his hands, playing the part of a nervous but greedy courier. "That's not what we agreed on. The money first." It was a gamble, a calculated risk to buy him a few crucial seconds. As Elias was distracted by the talk of money, Marcus moved. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them, his left hand grabbing the arm holding the backpack, his right hand striking a precise nerve cluster in Elias's neck. The man grunted, his body going limp for a moment, just as Marcus had been trained. Marcus grabbed the backpack, unzipped it, and saw the device. It was crude but effective, a series of chemical containers wired to a keypad and a timer. The countdown was already active, 90 seconds. His fingers flew across the keypad, his mind a steel trap of codes and sequences he had memorized weeks ago. 8-4-J-1-T-7, the abort code. He slammed the final key. The red light on the device flickered and died. A wave of immense relief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. At that exact moment, the alley was flooded with tactical officers. They swarmed in from both ends, weapons raised, shouting commands. The spotter, who had been hiding in a nearby doorway, was taken down before he could even react. Elias, recovering from the nerve strike, was wrestled to the ground and cuffed. It was over. Standing in the middle of the chaotic but controlled scene, Marcus took a deep breath of the city air, which, thanks to his actions, was still safe to breathe. The arrest, the humiliation, the race against time, it had all led to this. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives had been saved. He had been through hell and back in the span of 3 hours. He had been wrongfully arrested, and minutes later, he had saved the city. The whiplash was dizzying, but as he looked at the neutralized device, a quiet, profound sense of victory settled over him. They had failed to break him, and because of that, a terrible tragedy had been averted. The next morning, the city woke up to 2 stories. The first was a brief, sanitized news report about a foiled terror plot, praising the swift and decisive action of federal and local law enforcement. It mentioned a neutralized device and several arrests, but the details were vague, shrouded in the necessary secrecy of national security. For most citizens, it was a frightening but ultimately reassuring piece of news. The second story was the one that truly caught fire. It started with a single video uploaded to social media. It was the footage from the bystander on the overpass, shot with a steady hand and a clear lens. The title was simple: APD cuffs FBI agent during traffic stop. The video was explosive. It showed a calm, well-dressed black man being surrounded, aggressively manhandled, and forced to his knees by 3 white police officers. The audio was clear enough to capture Marcus's calm, declarative statements and the officer's loud, angry commands. By 8 a.m., it had 1 million views. By noon, it had 10 million. The comment section was a torrent of fury. "This is racial profiling, plain and simple." He did everything right and they still treated him like an animal. That Officer Vance was completely out of control. Then came the second wave. A source from within the police department, disgusted by the incident, leaked Officer Riley's body cam footage to a local investigative journalist. This footage was even more damning. It provided the audio context that the bystander video lacked. It captured Vance's fabricated reason for the stop, Marcus's clear identification of himself as a federal agent, and the officer's blatant disregard for protocol. The 2 videos, played side by side on news websites and cable channels, created a narrative so powerful and so infuriating that it was impossible to ignore. The public outcry was swift and deafening. The mayor's office was flooded with calls. The police department's social media pages were overwhelmed with angry comments demanding accountability. The story of the foiled terror plot was completely overshadowed by the story of the corrupt, abusive arrest. The hero of one story was the victim of the other. By mid-afternoon, the Atlanta police chief, a man who usually projected an image of unflappable control, was forced to hold a press conference. He looked beleaguered, his face etched with stress. "The footage circulating online is deeply disturbing," he began, reading from a prepared statement. "The actions depicted are not consistent with the training and standards of this department. A full and immediate internal investigation has been launched. The primary officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation." It was the standard boilerplate response, but it did nothing to quell the public's anger. The FBI, which rarely comments on personnel matters, was also forced to issue a statement. AIC Reynolds himself delivered it. "We can confirm that an on-duty special agent of the FBI was wrongfully detained yesterday by members of the APD," Reynolds stated, his face like stone. "This agent's detention was improper and unnecessarily endangered a critical national security operation. We are fully cooperating with the Department of Justice, which is now reviewing the incident for potential civil rights violations." The phrase, "civil rights violations," was a cannon shot. It elevated the incident from a local police matter to a federal case. The viral storm had become a Category 5 hurricane, and it was heading directly for Officer Ryan Vance, Sergeant Frank Davis, and the entire police department. Marcus watched the press conferences from a secure FBI facility where he was being debriefed. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a story about someone else. The man on the screen, the victim of this gross injustice, didn't feel like him. He was Agent Thorne, the man who had neutralized the bomb, the man who had completed his mission. But the two identities were now inextricably linked. The public now knew that the man who had been so cruelly humiliated on the side of the highway was the same man who had saved them just an hour later. It made the injustice feel even more profound, and the public's demand for accountability even louder. The condemnation was no longer just official, it was personal, and it was universal. The public firestorm was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, the institutional weight of the United States government began to move with terrifying force and precision. AIC Reynolds's promise of involving the U.S. Attorney's Office was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Within 48 hours of the incident, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had formally opened an investigation into the Atlanta Police Department, with the arrest of Special Agent Marcus Thorne as its primary focus. For Marcus, the days following the incident were a blur of debriefings, psychological evaluations, and meetings with federal prosecutors. He recounted the events of the arrest over and over, his memory a perfect, crystalline record of every word, every action, every violation. The Bureau surrounded him with a wall of support. He was not just an employee, he was one of their own who had been wronged, and the institution was now moving to defend him. Armed with the unshakable video evidence and Marcus's testimony, the FBI's legal counsel on his behalf filed a civil lawsuit against the city and the three officers involved, Vance, Miller, and Riley. The lawsuit sought $2 million in damages, not for personal enrichment, but as a punitive measure designed to force systemic change. The legal filing was a surgical dissection of the arrest, citing illegal search and seizure, false imprisonment, and a violation of Marcus's civil rights under the color of law. The internal investigation at the police department, now under the watchful eye of federal investigators, could no longer be a whitewash. Sergeant Davis was the first to fall. Faced with the undeniable evidence and the threat of federal charges for covering up the misconduct, he gave a full and truthful account of the events. He admitted that Vance had no probable cause for the stop, that he had witnessed the illegal search, and that his decision to bring Marcus to the station was an attempt to contain the situation rather than correct it. He was suspended indefinitely and offered early retirement, a quiet and ignominious end to a 25-year career. Officers Miller and Riley, facing similar pressure, also gave statements that corroborated the video evidence. They painted a picture of Vance as an aggressive officer who had instigated and escalated the entire encounter. Their complicity was noted, and both were placed on desk duty and scheduled for mandatory retraining, their careers permanently tarnished. The full weight of the fallout, however, landed squarely on Officer Ryan Vance. His career didn't just tarnish, it unraveled completely. The investigation into Marcus's arrest prompted a full review of Vance's file. The pattern that Sergeant Davis had long suspected was now laid bare for all to see. They found a dozen similar complaints of aggressive traffic stops against minority drivers, all previously dismissed. But with the national spotlight now glaring down, those old cases were reopened. Witnesses were re-interviewed, and a clear picture emerged of a young officer who used his badge as a weapon of intimidation, fueled by bias and a volatile temper. He was a liability the city could no longer afford. Less than a week after the incident, pending the outcome of the federal investigation, Officer Ryan Vance was terminated from the police force. His badge and gun were taken. His career in law enforcement was over. He had started a war with a man he wrongly assumed was powerless, and had ended up being crushed by an institution he had foolishly underestimated. Marcus felt no joy in Vance's downfall. He saw it as a sad but necessary consequence. The real victory wasn't in the punishment of one officer, but in the exposure of the system that had enabled him for so long. The lawsuit was no longer just about his own experience. It had become a catalyst, a crowbar prying open a department that desperately needed to let the light in. The weight of the law was slow, but it was thorough, and it was grinding away at the very foundation of the injustice he had endured. The lawsuit never went to trial. Faced with irrefutable video evidence, the testimony of a decorated FBI agent, and the looming threat of a federal civil rights case, the city's attorneys knew they had an unwinnable hand. They moved to settle. After a series of quiet negotiations, the city agreed to pay the full $2 million sought in the lawsuit. They also agreed to a series of sweeping reforms within the police department, including mandatory de-escalation training, implicit bias screening for new recruits, and an automated review system to flag officers with a high number of citizen complaints. When the news became public, Marcus made a single statement through his attorney. He announced that the entire settlement amount would be placed in a trust to fund scholarships and community outreach programs for at-risk youth in the very neighborhoods that Officer Vance used to patrol. He would not keep a single dollar. His goal was never personal enrichment. It was to ensure that what happened to him would be less likely to happen to others who didn't have a federal agency to back them up. Justice, for Marcus, was not about revenge. It was about reform. With the legal battles concluded, a quiet victory settled over Marcus. Vance was gone, Davis was retired, and the department was being forced to change. The mission was a success, and the city was safe. Life could, in theory, return to normal. But Marcus knew that some experiences leave an indelible mark. The memory of the cold steel on his wrists, the feeling of utter powerlessness, that would never truly fade. It had become a part of him, a quiet reminder of the fragility of justice. His true victory came a few months later. He was invited to speak at a community center, the same one that would be administering the scholarship fund he had created. He stood before an audience of teenagers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He didn't talk to them as an FBI agent. He talked to them as a man who understood what it felt like to be judged by the color of his skin. He told them his story, not with anger, but with a quiet, firm resolve. The most powerful tool you have in a moment of injustice is your own integrity, he told them. They can take your freedom, they can humiliate you, but they can never take your composure unless you give it to them. Let your character be your shield. Let the truth be your sword. The story of his arrest, once a symbol of his humiliation, had transformed into a powerful lesson in resilience. The videos that had once sparked outrage now served as a training manual for how to survive an unjust encounter with grace and strength. The name Ryan Vance was already fading into obscurity, but the example set by Marcus Thorne had become a lasting, resonant message. The storm has passed. In the quiet aftermath, we are left to ponder the currents that created it. What drives a man like Officer Vance? It isn't simple hatred. It's a more complex, insidious blend of insecurity, ego, and a deeply ingrained us versus them mentality, often fostered in high-stress police environments. He saw a black man whose calmness and confidence didn't fit his prejudiced worldview. Marcus's FBI badge wasn't a sign of a colleague. It was a challenge to his authority, an invalidation of his gut feeling. In that moment on the highway, forcing Marcus to submit became more important than upholding the law. Vance's actions were the desperate thrashings of a small man trying to feel powerful. We can also ask, what if? What if Marcus had immediately announced, "I'm an FBI agent, don't you know who I am?" Would it have changed anything? Likely not. It might have even provoked Vance sooner. His calm, by-the-book approach was not only a testament to his character, but also the perfect legal strategy. He did everything right in a situation that was fundamentally wrong. What if Sergeant Davis had made the right call on the scene? It would have saved Marcus an hour of hell, but perhaps the greater injustice within the department would have remained hidden. Sometimes, a crisis is necessary to expose a chronic disease. The story of Marcus Thorne is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't measured by the ability to exert force, but by the discipline to maintain one's character under pressure. It teaches us that injustice thrives in silence and secrecy, and that the unblinking eye of a camera, paired with a courageous voice, can be the most potent force for accountability in the modern world. What do you think is the most effective way to address bias in policing? If you found yourself in a similar situation, do you believe you could remain as calm as Agent Thorne? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please subscribe for more stories that need to be told.